listeners, and welcome back to Willow's Wonderful Tales. Today I'll be continuing the story of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners busily painting the roses red. Why, they look just like playing cards, thought Alice. This was very strange, and she went closer to watch them. Look out now, 5, don't splash paint on me like that. I couldn't help it, said 5. 7 bumped my elbow. 7 looked up and said, That's right, 5. Always blame it on others. You'd better not talk, said 5. I heard the Queen say yesterday you deserved to be beheaded. What for? Said the one who had spoken first. That's none of your business, 2, said 7. Yes, it is his business, said 5, and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions. 7 flung down his brush and had just begun, Well, of all the unfair things, when his eye suddenly fell upon Alice, as she stood watching them. He stopped himself quickly. The others saw her too, and all of them bowed. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, why are you painting those roses? 2 began in a low voice. Well, you see, miss, this should have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. If the Queen found out, we would have our heads cut off. So we're doing our best to... At that moment, 5, who had been looking around the garden, called out, The Queen! The Queen! The 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was the sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked around to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs, who also looked like cards, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next came 10 courtiers, decorated all over with diamonds. They walked 2 by 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children, with hearts upon their garments. There were 10 of them, and they were jumping along hand in hand. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was smiling at everything that was said and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts carrying the king's crown on a red velvet cushion. And last of all, at the end of the grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice wasn't sure if she should lie down on her face like the gardeners. She couldn't remember a rule about lying down for procession. And besides, she thought, what is the use of a procession if people have to lie down upon their faces? Then they're not able to see it. So she stood still where she was and waited. When the procession came to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her. The Queen said, Who is this? To the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. Fool, said the Queen, tossing her head and turning to Alice. What is your name, child? My name is Alice, your Majesty, said Alice very politely as she thought. Why, they're only a pack of cards. I don't need to be afraid of them. And who are these? Said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying face down in front of the rose tree. How should I know? Said Alice, surprised at her own courage. It's no business of mine. The Queen turned red with fury and screamed, Off with her head, off! Nonsense, said Alice very loudly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon the Queen's arm and quietly said, My dear, she is only a child. The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the Knave, Turn them over. The Knave carefully turned them over with 1 foot. Get up, said the Queen in a loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up. They began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. Stop that, screamed the Queen. You're making me dizzy. She turned to the rose tree and said, What have you been doing down here? Your Majesty, said 2, going down on 1 knee as he spoke. We were trying... I see, said the Queen, who was looking at the roses. Off with their heads. The royal group left. 3 of the soldiers stayed behind to execute the gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. You won't be executed, said Alice, and she put them in a large flower pot that stood near. 3 soldiers wandered about looking for them, then quietly marched off after the others. Are their heads off? Shouted the Queen. Their heads are gone, your Majesty, the soldiers shouted in reply. Can you play croquet? The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice as the question was meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice. Come on, then, yelled the Queen, and Alice joined the procession. It's a nice day, said a voice at her side. It was the White Rabbit peeping into her face. Very, said Alice. Where's the Duchess? Shh, said the Rabbit. He looked over his shoulder and then raised himself up on tiptoe so he could whisper in her ear. She's been arrested and will be executed. What for? Said Alice. Did you say what a pity? The Rabbit asked. No, I didn't, said Alice. I said what for? She boxed the Queen's ears, the Rabbit began. Alice laughed. Shh. The Rabbit whispered, The Queen will hear you. You see, the Duchess was late, and the Queen said, Get in your places, shouted the Queen. People ran around in all directions. They finally settled down and the game began. Alice had never seen such a strange croquet ground. There were lots of hills and holes. The balls were live hedgehogs and the mallets were live flamingos. The soldiers stood on their hands and feet to make the arches. Alice tried to hold her flamingo still, but it kept twisting around so it could look at Alice. She couldn't help laughing. When she finally got the flamingo to hold still, she looked down and found that the hedgehog had run away. It was a hard and confusing game. The players played at the same time. No one took turns. They argued about everything, and the queen went stomping around screaming, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head," every minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. She had not yet had an argument with the queen, but she knew it might happen at any minute. She started looking around for a way to leave when she noticed a curious appearance in the air, a grin. "It's the Cheshire Cat," she said to herself. "Now I will have somebody to talk to." "How are you doing?" said the cat, as soon as there was enough mouth for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared and then nodded. "There's no use speaking to it till its ears have come," she thought. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo. She began to tell the cat about the game. The cat seemed to think his head was enough, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play fairly," Alice said, "and they all argue, and they don't have any rules. You have no idea how confusing it is using flamingos and hedgehogs and arches that walk away." "How do you like the queen?" asked the cat. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so—" Just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her listening. She went on, "Likely to win that it's not worth finishing the game." The queen smiled and walked by. "Whom are you talking to?" said the king, walking up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "I don't like the looks of it," said the king, "but it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Don't be disrespectful," said the king, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat can look at a king," said Alice. "I read that in a book somewhere." "Well, it must be removed," said the king, and he called the queen. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had one way of settling problems, great or small. "Off with his head," she said without even looking up. "I'll get the executioner myself," said the king, and he hurried off. He quickly returned with the executioner, and a crowd began to gather around. A disagreement began between the king, the executioner, and the queen. They were all talking at once, while the entire crowd was silent and uncomfortable. Alice asked if she could help settle the question. They all started speaking to her at once, so she found it hard to know exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded. The queen's argument was that if something weren't done soon, then she'd have everybody executed. Alice could not think of anything else to say but, "The cat belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it." "She's in prison," the queen said to the executioner. "Bring her here." And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment the executioner was gone. By the time the executioner had come back with the Duchess, the cat had disappeared completely. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for the Cheshire Cat's head while the rest of the party went back to the game.